There's a place in our town that people speak about in hushed tones, almost like a secret. It's an old forest tucked behind the hills, where the sunlight barely reaches the ground. Officially, it's called Pine Hollow Reserve, but locals gave it another name, the Whispering Woods. For as long as anyone can remember, stories about the forest have been shared around campfires and in quiet kitchens. Some say it's haunted, others claim it's cursed. But everyone agrees on one thing: when you're there, you're never really alone. Started with small things. Hikers would come back, swearing they'd heard someone calling their name, but when they turned around, there was no one there. Families picnicking at the edge of the woods would notice belongings disappearing, only to find them days later, neatly arranged at the forest's entrance. And then there were the shadows, those fleeting figures spotted between the trees, just far enough to make you doubt your own eyes. Most people laugh it off as folklore, something to scare kids into staying close to home. But there are others, like Sam and Clara, who don't find it funny at all. Sam and Clara were siblings, separated by only a year, and inseparable since birth. They'd grown up hearing their grandfather's stories about the woods, tales of people who went in and never came out, of strange lights flickering between the trees at night. But they'd never paid much attention, chalking it up to his love of spinning tall tales. Until the day their dog, Rusty, darted into the woods and didn't come back. That was 2 days ago. When the search party came up empty, Sam and Clara couldn't shake the feeling that the adults weren't looking in the right places. Everyone was too focused on the main trails, but Sam swore he'd seen Rusty running deeper into the woods, toward an overgrown path no one seemed willing to talk about. Clara, always the braver of the two, grabbed her flashlight and told Sam they had to check it out themselves. She tried to sound confident, but even she couldn't hide the unease creeping into her voice. As they stepped off the familiar trail and into the unmarked part of the forest, it felt like crossing into another world. The air grew colder, the trees seemed impossibly tall, and the silence was almost unbearable. Every snap of a twig made them jump. But what really set their nerves on edge was the feeling, like the forest was watching them. Clara laughed it off at first, teasing Sam for looking over his shoulder every few seconds. But soon she was doing it too. After what felt like hours, they stumbled upon a small clearing. At its center stood an ancient stone well, crumbling and covered in moss. Something about it felt wrong, but before they could decide what to do, they heard it. A faint sound like a dog whining coming from the well's depths. "Rusty," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. And then, unmistakably, came the sound of claws scratching against stone. Clara and Sam froze, their eyes locked on the dark, gaping hole of the well. The scratching sound came again, faint but deliberate, like whatever was down there was trying to climb its way up. Sam's heart pounded so loudly he was sure Clara could hear it. Neither of them dared to move closer, but they couldn't bring themselves to leave either. The sound was unmistakable. Rusty was down there. But how? And more importantly, how could they get him out? "I'm going down," Clara said, breaking the silence. Her voice was steadier than Sam expected, but her grip on the flashlight betrayed her nerves. "Are you crazy?" Sam hissed, grabbing her arm. "We don't even know how deep that thing is. What if it's not Rusty?" Clara looked at him, her face pale but determined. "You heard him. That's Rusty. We can't just leave him down there." She pulled her arm free and stepped closer to the edge, shining the flashlight down into the well. The beam of light barely penetrated the darkness. The stone walls seemed to stretch endlessly, and the bottom remained hidden, swallowed by shadows. "Clara, wait," Sam pleaded, but she ignored him, crouching down to peer inside. That's when they heard it again. Not just the scratching, but a low, almost human-like groan that sent chills racing down their spines. Sam took a step back, his mind racing. "What if it's a trap?" he blurted out before he could stop himself. Clara turned to him, confusion flashing across her face. "A trap? By who?" "Sam, it's a dog. Rusty's down there." "He's probably hurt," she said, but her voice wavered now, uncertainty creeping in. "Think about it," Sam whispered urgently. "What if it's not Rusty? What if something else is mimicking him?" You've heard the stories. This place isn't normal. Clara hesitated, the flashlight trembling slightly in her hand. Sam could see the internal battle playing out in her mind. She wanted to believe it was Rusty, wanted to believe they could save him, but the weight of the forest's legends was pressing down on both of them now. Before she could respond, the scratching stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening, more oppressive than any sound. They both stood still, straining to hear something, anything. And then, faintly, came the sound of breathing. Slow, heavy breathing, echoing up from the well. It wasn't a dog. Clara scrambled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. What was that? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Sam shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. I don't know. But we need to go. Now. But just as they turned to leave, a voice floated up from the darkness. It was soft, almost soothing, and yet it sent ice through their veins. Don't go. I need your help. Sounded like Rusty. But there was something else, a distortion in the tone that wasn't quite right. Clara and Sam froze, caught between the instinct to run and the pull of the voice calling them back. Clara's grip tightened on the flashlight, her knuckles white. The voice had stopped, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. Sam stared at her, waiting for her to say something, to decide what they should do next, but she just stood there, frozen, staring at the well. Neither of them spoke, as if breaking the quiet would somehow awaken whatever was lurking below. Then, without warning, the flashlight flickered. Clara smacked it against her palm, trying to steady the beam, but it dimmed again before sputtering back to life. The weak glow barely cut through the darkness around them, and for the first time, Sam felt how vast the forest truly was. The trees seemed to close in, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers, and the air felt heavier, almost suffocating. Clara, we have to leave, Sam whispered, his voice trembling. He tugged at her sleeve, trying to pull her away from the well. This isn't right. Something's wrong here. But Clara didn't move. Her eyes were locked on the opening, as if she could see something Sam couldn't. What if it really is him, Sam? She whispered, her voice cracking. What if he's hurt and we just leave him here? Sam wanted to argue, to insist they get out of there, but something about the look on her face stopped him. He knew how much Rusty meant to her, how she'd raised him from a puppy when he was sick and frail. He couldn't blame her for wanting to believe it was him. Still, every instinct in his body screamed that they needed to run, and fast. Before he could say anything, the flashlight flickered again, plunging them into brief darkness. And in that moment they heard it. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate, and impossibly close. They weren't coming from the well but from behind them, deeper in the forest. Clara spun around, the light sputtering back to life just in time to reveal nothing. There was no one there, but the sound of footsteps didn't stop. They seemed to circle the clearing, slow and measured, as if whatever was making them was toying with them. Sam, Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. Do you hear that? He nodded, his throat too dry to speak. His heart pounded as he scanned the darkness, straining to see anything beyond the faint edge of the flashlight's beam. The footsteps paused, and for a moment the silence was even worse. Then came the sound of something scratching against bark, like claws raking down a tree trunk. Clara took a step closer to Sam, her bravado from earlier gone. We need to go, she said, her voice shaking. But as they turned to leave the clearing, the voice from the well returned, louder this time and filled with urgency. Don't leave me. Please, I need you. It sounded desperate, pleading, but there was something else beneath it, a growling edge that made the hair on the back of Sam's neck stand up. He grabbed Clara's arm, pulling her toward the path they'd come from. But just as they started to run, the light caught something moving at the edge of the trees. Just a shadow, but enough to make them freeze. And then the voice spoke again, this time from the woods. You can't leave. You're already too far in. Clara and Sam stared at each other, their fear mirrored in each other's faces. Whatever this was, it wasn't just the well anymore. The forest itself seemed alive, closing in around them, and they had no idea which way to run. Clara and Sam stood frozen, their breaths shallow, as the voice echoed from the trees. It sounded like it came from everywhere and nowhere at once, wrapping around them like a cold mist. The flashlight flickered again, casting jittery shadows that seemed to move on their own. The clearing no longer felt like an open space. It felt like a trap, like the forest was closing in, inch by inch. "We have to move," Sam whispered, gripping Clara's arm tightly. "We can't just stand here." Clara nodded, her face pale but determined. She pointed the flashlight toward the path they'd come from, but it was as if the forest had swallowed it. The trail was gone, replaced by an impenetrable wall of trees that hadn't been there before. Panic surged in Sam's chest as he realized the forest was changing, twisting itself to keep them in. "Do you remember which way we came?" Clara asked, her voice barely audible. I don't know," Sam admitted, his mind racing. Every direction looked the same now, and the trees seemed denser, their branches reaching out like clawed hands. "We just need to pick a direction and go. Standing here isn't going to help." Clara hesitated, then nodded. She turned toward what she thought was the clearest path and started moving, Sam close behind her. The forest was eerily silent now, the footsteps and scratching replaced by a stillness that was somehow worse. Each step felt heavier than the last, like the air itself was trying to hold them back. Then the voice came again, this time softer, almost a whisper. "Don't go. You belong here." Clara stopped in her tracks, gripping the flashlight so tightly her knuckles turned white. Sam looked at her, his fear mirrored in her wide eyes. "It's just trying to scare us," he said, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. "Keep going." They pushed forward, the ground beneath them uneven and covered in tangled roots. The light from the flashlight barely cut through the darkness, and every now and then, Clara would shine it behind them, half expecting to see something, or someone, following them. But there was nothing, just the endless stretch of trees and shadows. As they moved deeper into the forest, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They didn't just come from one place now. They were all around, overlapping and blending into an eerie, inhuman chorus. Some of the voices sounded like people they knew, while others were distorted, guttural, and unrecognizable. Clara's hands shook as she tried to focus on the path ahead, but the whispers were relentless, pulling at her mind. "Sam," she said suddenly, her voice trembling. "Do you hear that?" "Hear what?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening. "They're saying my name," Clara whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "They're calling me." Sam grabbed her arm, his grip firm. "Don't listen to them. It's not real." But even as he said it, he wasn't sure. The forest didn't feel like it belonged to the world they knew anymore. It felt alive, ancient, and malevolent, as if it had been waiting for them all along. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered one last time before dying completely, plunging them into absolute darkness. Clara let out a gasp, and Sam reached for her hand, pulling her close. "It's okay," he lied, though his own heart was racing. "We'll figure this out." Then, from somewhere ahead, a faint light appeared, dim and flickering, like a lantern swaying in the distance. It didn't make sense. There shouldn't have been anyone else out here, but the sight of it was enough to stir a mix of hope and fear in both of them. "Do you think it's someone who can help?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sam didn't answer right away. Something about the light didn't feel right, but it was their only lead. "We don't have a choice," he said finally. "Let's go." They started toward the light, the whispers fading slightly with each step. But as they got closer, the light didn't grow brighter. It stayed faint, just out of reach, like it was leading them deeper into the forest. And then they heard it again, low and guttural, from somewhere just beyond the glow. "Closer. You're almost home." Clara hesitated as they neared the faint light, her steps slowing with every inch closer. Sam felt her hand tighten around his, and he couldn't tell if it was for her comfort or his. The light continued to sway, almost rhythmically, like it was hanging from an invisible hand. But the closer they got, the stranger it seemed. It wasn't steady like a lantern or flashlight. It pulsed faintly, almost breathing, and its glow was an unnatural mix of colors: blue, green, and a faint flicker of red. "Sam, this doesn't feel right," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of their footsteps crunching on the forest floor. "What if it's not someone helping us?" "I know," Sam admitted, his voice low and tense. "But if we turn back now, we'll just be wandering blind. At least this gives us a direction." Clara swallowed hard, nodding reluctantly. Together they pressed forward, the whispers growing quieter but never entirely fading. The forest around them seemed to change again, the trees leaning closer together, their branches intertwining overhead like a cage. The air was colder now, damp and heavy, and each breath felt like it took effort. As they approached the source of the light, it became clear it wasn't coming from any object they could see. It seemed to hover, untethered, in the air above a small, unnatural clearing. The ground here was bare, devoid of leaves or grass, and at the center was a circle of smooth, black stones arranged in a pattern neither of them recognized. The light flickered above the stones, casting long shadows that stretched unnaturally, twisting and curling like living things. Clara's grip on Sam's hand tightened further. "We shouldn't be here," she said, her voice trembling. This isn't right." Sam opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the light flared suddenly, blinding them for a moment. Clara gasped, and Sam shielded his eyes. When the light dimmed again, something was standing in the clearing. At first, it looked like a person, but as Sam squinted to focus, he realized it wasn't. The figure was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Its face was indistinct, shrouded in shadow, but its eyes, two pinpoints of glowing red light, stared directly at them. "Who's there?" Sam called out, his voice shaky but defiant. Clara pulled him back, her fear palpable. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised one long, spindly arm and pointed directly at Clara. Its voice, when it spoke, was a deep, rasping whisper that seemed to echo from everywhere at once. "You were called," it said. "You belong here." Clara shook her head, stepping back. "No," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't know what you're talking about." Sam positioned himself in front of her, his heart racing. "Stay away from her," he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. The figure tilted its head, as if amused. Then it took a single deliberate step forward, and the black stones at its feet began to glow faintly, pulsing in time with the strange light. The whispers returned, louder now, swirling around them like a storm. Sam grabbed Clara's arm. "Run," he said, pulling her back toward the path they'd come from. But as they turned, the trees behind them seemed to shift, closing in like the bars of a cage. The way back was gone. "You cannot leave," the figure said, its voice resonating with the whispers. "You came willingly. The forest has chosen." Clara's breathing grew rapid, panic taking hold. "Sam, what do we do?" she cried, clutching his arm. Sam looked around desperately, his mind racing. Every instinct told him they were trapped, but he refused to accept it. He turned back toward the clearing, the light, and the figure. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice trembling. The figure didn't move, but the whispers grew deafening, and the stones pulsed brighter. "A choice," it said. "One stays. One leaves." Sam's stomach dropped, the weight of the words sinking in. He turned to Clara, her face pale and tear-streaked. Neither of them spoke, the enormity of what they were hearing too much to process. The forest waited, silent and still, as the light swayed above them, casting its haunting glow. Clara's breathing quickened, her grip on Sam's arm trembling. The figure stood motionless, its eerie red eyes fixed on them, waiting. The forest around them felt alive, the air charged with something ancient and malevolent. Sam's mind raced, trying to process the impossible choice laid before them. "One stays. One leaves." The words echoed in his head, chilling him to his core. "No," Sam said finally, stepping in front of Clara. "We're not playing your game. We're both leaving." The figure tilted its head, almost as if amused. The glowing stones beneath its feet pulsed brighter, and the whispers grew louder, swirling around them like a rising storm. "The forest decides," it said, its voice like the scraping of stone. "The forest always decides." Clara pulled at Sam's arm, her voice trembling. "Sam, please. Let's just figure this out. There has to be another way." But before Sam could respond, the light above the stones flared again, bathing the clearing in an unnatural glow. Clara gasped, and Sam turned to see something he hadn't noticed before. The stones were arranged in a circle, but at the center was something he hadn't realized. Another figure. It was smaller, hunched, its features obscured by shadow. But as the light shifted, Sam saw it clearly. It was Rusty. Clara let out a choked sob, taking a step forward, but Sam grabbed her arm, holding her back. Rusty's form was still, his body rigid and unnatural, as though he wasn't entirely real. His eyes glowed faintly, the same eerie red as the figures, and his mouth opened in a silent, unnatural whine. "That's not him," Sam said firmly, his voice trembling. "It's a trick." Clara hesitated, her heart torn between fear and hope. "But what if it is?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "What if we're wrong?" The figure in the clearing stepped aside, gesturing toward Rusty with one long skeletal arm. "Take him," it said. "But one must stay." Sam clenched his fists, his mind spinning. The figure wasn't lying. He could feel the weight of the truth in its words. If they tried to take Rusty and leave, the forest wouldn't let them go. Something or someone had to remain behind. "No," Sam said again, stepping forward. "You can't make us choose. You don't control us." The figure's head tilted again, the red glow of its eyes narrowing. "The forest controls all," it said, and the whispers around them turned to a deafening roar. In that moment, Clara made her choice. Before Sam could stop her, she broke free of his grip and ran toward the circle. The moment she crossed the boundary of the stones, the light flared brighter than ever, blinding Sam and forcing him to shield his eyes. He shouted her name, but the roar of the whispers drowned out his voice. When the light faded, the clearing was silent. Rusty lay motionless at the center of the stones, his body limp and still. Clara was gone. Sam staggered forward, his heart pounding. "Clara!" he shouted, his voice echoing into the stillness. But there was no response. The figure was gone, the stones dark and lifeless, and the forest around him was silent once more. As Sam knelt by Rusty's side, tears streaming down his face, he felt a faint warmth beneath his hand. Rusty stirred, letting out a weak whine, and for a moment, hope flared in Sam's chest. But as he looked into the dog's eyes, he froze. They glowed red, faint but unmistakable. From somewhere deep in the forest, a familiar voice whispered, soft and chilling. "You belong to the forest now, Sam. Just like me." Sam froze, his hand still resting on Rusty's side as the faint red glow in the dog's eyes flickered and then faded. Rusty whimpered softly, shifting as though trying to stand, but his legs trembled beneath him. Sam pulled him close, wrapping his arms around the dog, desperate for the comfort of something familiar. Yet the whispering voice that had echoed through the forest lingered in his mind. Clara's voice. He shook his head, refusing to accept what he'd heard. The forest was quiet now, eerily so. The oppressive weight that had surrounded them was gone, but it left an unsettling stillness in its wake. Sam tried to focus on the task at hand. Getting out of the forest. Rusty needed help, and the thought of returning home, of being somewhere safe, was the only thing keeping him moving. He stood, cradling Rusty in his arms, and turned toward where the clearing's edge should have been. The trees, which had felt like an impenetrable barrier before, now seemed to part slightly, revealing a faint trail. Sam took a hesitant step forward, glancing back at the circle of stones one last time. They were dark now, lifeless and ordinary, as though nothing strange had ever happened there. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was still watching him. The walk back felt longer than it should have. The trail twisted and turned, and Sam's legs grew heavier with each step, but he pushed forward. Rusty's quiet breathing was the only sound in the oppressive silence, a small reminder that he wasn't completely alone. Still, his mind raced with questions. What had really happened in the clearing? Why had the forest let him leave? And Clara, was she truly gone, or was she still here somewhere, lost in the shadows? Finally, Sam saw a break in the trees. The sight of the open sky above the edge of the forest filled him with relief, but it was bittersweet. He stepped out onto the familiar path leading back to town, glancing over his shoulder one last time. The forest loomed behind him, dark and unyielding, but it felt different now, as if it had claimed something from him that he could never get back. When Sam reached his house, the lights from the porch felt almost too bright, too warm after the oppressive darkness of the woods. His parents ran out to meet him, their worried faces softening with relief when they saw Rusty in his arms. They asked him 1,000 questions, but Sam couldn't bring himself to answer. He only shook his head, his voice caught somewhere between exhaustion and grief. That night, as Sam lay awake in bed, Rusty curled up at his feet. He thought he heard it again. A faint whisper, so soft it could have been his imagination. But it wasn't. It was Clara's voice, distant but clear. "Take care of him, Sam." Sam sat up, his heart pounding, but the room was silent. He looked down at Rusty, who stirred in his sleep, letting out a soft whimper. Sam reached out to stroke the dog's fur, his mind heavy with thoughts he couldn't untangle. Clara was gone, but a part of her felt close, tied to the forest in a way he would never fully understand. He didn't know if he'd ever go back to the woods. Part of him wanted to find answers, to see if Clara was truly lost. But another part of him, the part that remembered the way the forest had seemed alive, warned him to stay far away. For now, all he could do was hold on to Rusty and hope that, wherever Clara was, she had found peace. The forest had taken her, but it hadn't taken everything. Sam was determined to hold on to the light that remained, no matter how small it felt.